Hey there, I'll be your narrator for today. Before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss a story. I'd love to know where are you watching from and what time is it there. Now, take a deep breath, relax, and let your mind drift. These horror stories will crawl under your skin and linger in the dark. Let's begin. My girlfriend, Chloe, and I thought we were being clever. We were both trying to get big projects off the ground that year. She was a painter working on a new series, and I was trying to finally wrestle a novel into submission. The city was just too much noise, too many distractions, too many invitations to go out and spend money we didn't really have. So we pooled our savings and rented a cabin for 3 months, from December through February. The listing we found online was perfect. It was described as wonderfully isolated, nestled deep in the woods on the edge of a vast state park, with the nearest neighbor miles down a winding, unpaved road. The pictures showed a rustic, cozy place with a big stone fireplace and large windows looking out into the dense forest. It was exactly the kind of solitary confinement we were looking for. The plan was simple. We would load up our old Subaru with groceries, art supplies, my laptop, and enough warm clothes to survive an Arctic expedition, and just disappear for the winter. We figured the intense quiet and the stark beauty of the snow-covered mountains would be the perfect catalyst for our work. The first few weeks were everything we had hoped for. The silence was so profound it felt like a physical presence, broken only by the crackle of the fire, the groan of wood settling in the cold, or the whisper of wind through the pines. The snow fell almost constantly, piling up in soft, clean drifts that buried the world in white. It was our own private snow globe. We fell into a comfortable routine. We'd wake up late, make coffee, and I'd write at a small desk by a window while Chloe painted in the main room where the light was best. In the afternoons, we'd bundle up and take short walks, just to feel the crisp air and stretch our legs, careful not to wander too far. The snow was a perfect record of our movements, our 2 sets of boot prints the only marks on the otherwise pristine landscape. We felt completely alone, and at first, that feeling was a comfort. It was the entire point. It was just us against the vast, quiet wilderness. The first odd thing happened about a month in. I went out to the woodpile near the side of the cabin to grab more logs for the stove. As I was stacking them in my arms, I noticed a single line of footprints in the snow. They were distinct, made by a heavy boot, much larger than mine or Chloe's. They came out of the dense tree line, walked directly to the back of the cabin, and then just stopped. There were no prints leading away. I stared at them for a long time, trying to make sense of it. They were partially filled with fresh powder, so they weren't brand new, maybe from the day before. I followed them with my eyes back to the woods. The forest was dark and thick, a wall of black trunks and heavy snow-laden branches. It was unsettling. My first thought was maybe it was a hunter or a lost hiker, but why would they walk up to the cabin and then just vanish? It looked like someone had just stood there, maybe for a long time, watching the house. I walked around the entire cabin, my boots crunching loudly in the quiet. There were no other marks. Just that one line of tracks. I decided not to mention it to Chloe. She was already a bit more spooked by the isolation than I was, and I didn't want to feed her anxiety. I told myself it was probably the property owner or a caretaker, just checking to make sure the pipes hadn't frozen. It was a flimsy explanation, but it was enough to let me push the unease down. A week later, things got weirder. We had a small cast iron boot scraper by the front door, a heavy thing shaped like a squirrel. One morning, it was gone. We both noticed it at the same time. "Did you move the squirrel?" Chloe asked, peering out the front door. I hadn't. We looked around the small porch area. Nothing. The snow was undisturbed. It was as if it had just evaporated. We spent 10 minutes searching, confused. It wasn't valuable, it was just a chunk of metal. It made no sense for someone to take it. We eventually gave up, blaming our own forgetfulness, convincing ourselves we must have put it somewhere inside and forgotten. But later that day, I found it. I had driven the car a little further down the driveway to clear some fallen branches, and I saw it sitting perfectly centered on a large, flat rock about 50 feet into the woods, just past the edge of our clearing. It was placed there deliberately, facing the cabin. There were no footprints around it. The snow was a smooth, unbroken blanket. I just stood there, the cold air burning my lungs, staring at that stupid iron squirrel. A cold feeling, completely different from the winter air, crept up my spine. Someone had taken it, walked into the woods without leaving tracks, which seemed impossible, and placed it there for us to find. It felt like a message. It felt like a game. This time, I had to tell Chloe. Her face went pale as I explained. The rational part of our brains tried to find an explanation, any explanation. A prank? A strange local tradition? But the truth was, we were miles from anyone. A prank would require a serious, dedicated effort. The atmosphere in the cabin changed after that. The comforting silence now felt menacing. Every creak of the house made us jump. The large, beautiful windows that we had loved now felt like dark, vulnerable eyes through which unseen things could be watching us. We started keeping the curtains drawn, even during the day, which made the small space feel claustrophobic and dim. We stopped taking our afternoon walks. The idea of being out in the open, away from the flimsy security of the cabin's locked door, was terrifying. We both tried to keep working, but the focus was gone. My words on the page felt hollow, and Chloe would just stare at her canvas for hours, her brushes untouched. The fear was a constant, low hum in the background of our lives. We'd find ourselves standing motionless, just listening to the quiet, straining to hear something, anything, out of place. One evening, as dusk was settling and painting the snow outside in shades of deep blue and purple, Chloe, who was standing by the kitchen window, suddenly gasped and took a step back. "What is it?" I asked, my heart immediately starting to pound. She was just shaking her head, her eyes wide. "I thought I saw something," she whispered. "Out there, by the trees, just a shape, a man. I went to the window, but there was nothing. Just the darkening woods, the same as always, but I believed her." The breaking point came a few nights later. A heavy, wet snow had started to fall in the afternoon, and by nightfall, it was a full-blown blizzard. The wind howled around the cabin, rattling the window frames. Sometime around midnight, the power went out. The lights flickered and died, and the hum of the refrigerator vanished, plunging us into a sudden, shocking silence and darkness. The only light came from the dying embers in the fireplace. We lit a few candles, their small flames dancing and casting long, distorted shadows across the room. We were huddled together on the couch, wrapped in blankets, when we heard the first sound. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping. It wasn't the wind. This was deliberate. It was coming from the back of the house, from the small window in the bedroom. Tap, tap, tap. We both froze, not even breathing. The sound stopped. We waited, our bodies rigid with tension. Then we heard a scraping noise, like fingernails or maybe a piece of metal being dragged slowly along the wooden siding of the cabin. It moved from the back of the house, along the side, and then stopped right below the large living room window, just feet from where we were sitting. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. We had no phone signal. The landline, which we hadn't even thought to test, was dead. The car was buried under a foot of new snow. We were trapped, completely and utterly trapped. "Maybe it's an animal," Chloe whispered, her voice trembling, but we both knew it wasn't. This was methodical. This was intelligent. Then came the soft jiggle of the front doorknob. It turned once, slowly, to the left, then to the right. It stopped. Silence. It was like something was testing our defenses, checking for a weakness. I grabbed the heavy iron poker from the fireplace, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold it. We didn't make a sound. We just sat there in the flickering candlelight, listening. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, and then I saw him. Through a small gap in the curtains, I saw a face. It was just for a second. The moon must have broken through the clouds, because the snow outside was suddenly illuminated in a pale, ghostly light. A man was standing there, not 10 feet from the window. He was large, wearing a dark parka with the hood up, obscuring most of his features, but I could see his eyes. They were fixed on the cabin. He wasn't doing anything, just standing perfectly still in the middle of the blizzard, watching. The sheer stillness of him was the most terrifying thing I have ever seen. He wasn't frantic or angry. He was patient. He was just waiting. I pulled Chloe away from the couch into the small, windowless bathroom. We locked the door and wedged a chair under the knob. We sat on the cold floor in total darkness, listening. We heard the footsteps then, crunching slowly in the snow as he began to circle the cabin. A slow, deliberate patrol. We heard him at each window, a soft bump as he must have leaned in to look. We stayed in that bathroom all night. We didn't talk. We just held each other, listening to the sounds of the storm and the sounds of the man who was circling our prison. Sometime before dawn, the sounds stopped. We waited, for what felt like forever, until the first gray light of morning started to filter under the bathroom door. I finally got up the courage to look outside. The blizzard had passed. The man was gone. But the snow, the perfect, pristine snow, was a mess. There was a deep, continuous trench circling the entire cabin, a path worn by hours of pacing. And at every single window and every door, there were dozens of footprints, clustered together where he had stood and looked and waited. We didn't even pack. We grabbed our wallets and our keys, fought our way through the snow to the car, and spent a frantic half-hour digging it out with our bare hands. We drove away and didn't look back. We never went back. We called the rental company from the first town we reached and told them we were leaving. We didn't tell them why. We didn't tell anyone. Who would believe us? There was no crime, not really. Nothing was stolen, except our sense of safety. We never found out who that man was or what he wanted. The not knowing is the worst part. He wasn't a monster, he was just a person, and he had all the time in the world. My field of study, historical geography, isn't exactly what you'd call thrilling. It's mostly poring over old maps, land deeds, and census records to figure out how and why people lived where they did. But I'd gotten lucky. I secured a small grant to do a summer field survey of a ghost settlement deep in the mountains, a place that barely even registered as a name on a few obscure maps from the 1840s. The official records were thin. It was an iron ore boom town that sprang up almost overnight and was abandoned just a few years later. The ledger from the company that funded it cited a rapid outbreak of typhus and subsequent financial collapse as the reason for its failure. My project was to map the physical remains of the settlement, cross-reference them with the few existing documents, and write a paper on the logistical challenges of resource extraction in the region during that period. I was excited. It felt like real hands-on history. I pictured myself as a kind of academic pioneer, rediscovering a lost piece of the past. I hiked in with enough gear and supplies to last for 2 weeks. The site was miles from the nearest maintained trail, a strenuous trek through thick, humid summer forest. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and pine, and alive with the constant drone of insects. When I finally found the clearing, it was almost swallowed by the forest. The ruins were subtle, just the ghost of a town. I found dozens of stone foundations, choked with weeds and saplings, arranged in what was once a crude street. The most prominent feature was the furnace stack, a crumbling tower of stone and brick that was surrendering to a thick blanket of ivy. It was profoundly quiet, the kind of deep silence that makes your ears ring. I set up my small tent in what I determined was the center of the old settlement, a relatively flat area that might have been a town square or common green. The first couple of days were productive. I was engrossed in my work, stretching out my measuring tape, sketching layouts in my waterproof notebook, and taking soil samples. It was slow, meticulous work, and I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The isolation was total, and it was exactly what I needed to concentrate. The first time I heard it, I was packing up my gear for the evening. The sun was setting, casting long, deep shadows through the trees, and the air was beginning to cool. It was a sound, faint but clear, that didn't belong. A rhythmic, metallic ringing, a clang, followed by a pause, then another clang. It sounded exactly like a blacksmith's hammer striking an anvil. I stopped what I was doing and listened, turning my head to try and pinpoint the direction. It seemed to come from the west, deeper in the woods. I wasn't alarmed, just curious. Sound can travel for miles in the mountains. I figured it must be a forestry crew, or maybe another camper setting up, though I hadn't seen anyone. The sound continued for another minute, steady and methodical, and then it just faded away. I made a quick note of it in my daily log, more as a curiosity than anything else, and went back to making my dinner. The forest was silent again, except for the chirping of crickets that had started their nightly chorus. Over the next few days, the sounds became more frequent and more varied. They were always on the periphery of my hearing, faint and fleeting, making me question if I'd heard them at all. One afternoon, while I was clearing brush from a collapsed foundation, I heard a low, grinding rumble, like the sound of heavy wooden wheels rolling over a rough track. It lasted for only a few seconds and then was gone. Another time I smelled wood smoke, acrid and strong as if from a dozen chimneys, but a quick scan of the horizon showed no smoke, and I knew my own small camp stove couldn't produce a smell that potent. The most unnerving part was the feeling that came with these sensory tricks. It was a feeling of being an intruder, of walking through a space that was already occupied by people I couldn't see. The silence of the forest no longer felt peaceful. It felt expectant, like the quiet of a room just after someone has left. I started talking to myself, just to fill the quiet. Okay, now we're measuring the east wall, I'd say out loud, my voice sounding thin and alien in the oppressive stillness. My primary source document was a digitized copy of a miner's journal that I had on my tablet. The man's name was Silas, and he'd been one of the first settlers. I spent my evenings in the tent reading his entries by the light of a headlamp. The early pages were filled with hope and descriptions of the hard labor. He wrote about the community, the births of children, the plans for a church. But about a year in, the tone of the journal began to shift. He stopped writing about the work and started writing about the quiet. He wrote that the men were becoming irritable and withdrawn. He mentioned arguments breaking out over nothing. Then his entries got stranger. Heard the furnace roar to life last night, though it has been cold for a week. Jones swore he heard his wife calling to him from the woods, but she was standing beside him at the time. There is a sickness in this air, but it is not of the body. It is a malady of the ear and of the eye. It makes a man doubt the ground beneath his own feet. The official record mentioned typhus, a sickness of the body, but Silas wrote about a sickness of the mind. One night, a week into my stay, a thunderstorm rolled in. The sky turned a bruised purple, and the wind began to whip through the trees with a low moan. I retreated to my tent, zipping it up tight against the coming rain. As the first drops began to spatter on the nylon, the sounds started, but this time they weren't faint. They were loud, immediate, and all around me. I heard the blacksmith's hammer again, not distant, but right outside my tent, a deafening, rhythmic clang that seemed to shake the very air. I heard the rumble of the ore carts, the shouting of men, their voices sharp with exertion and anger. I could hear snippets of conversation, words I couldn't quite make out, but the tones were clear, arguments and laughter and orders being barked into the wind. It was a full, rich soundscape of a bustling, working town. I could hear dogs barking, the cry of an infant from the direction of a collapsed cabin I had mapped earlier, the splintering crash of a falling tree. It was an auditory hallucination on a scale I couldn't have imagined. I scrambled for my headlamp, my hands trembling as I switched it on. The thin beam cut through the darkness of the tent. I was alone. Of course I was alone. But the sounds were so real. They were outside, all around me. A flash of lightning lit up the world outside the thin walls of my tent, and for a split second, I saw the clearing. It was empty, just the crumbling foundations and the lashing rain. But the sound, dear God, the sound. It was the sound of 100 people living and working and fighting right on top of me. The roar of the furnace was the worst part, a deep, guttural blast of air and fire that felt like it was coming from inside my own chest. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it did no good. The noise was inside my head, and then, through the cacophony, a single, clear thought emerged, a thought that felt ancient and cold and utterly alien. It wasn't my own voice. It was a quiet, insistent whisper that cut through the chaos. Leave this place. The ground remembers. It does not forget. That was it. I don't know if I actually heard it, or if my mind, under siege, simply produced it. But it felt like a warning from a place deeper and older than the ruins around me. I spent the rest of the night huddled in a corner of the tent, shaking. The phantom noise raged with the storm, a symphony of a dead town, and I felt a despair so profound it was almost physical. It was the crushing weight of failure, of fear, of a community unraveling. I felt the paranoia Silas had written about, the certainty that the trees were watching, that the very soil was hostile. When the first weak, gray light of dawn filtered through the clouds, the storm had passed, and the sounds were gone. The silence that returned was absolute, more complete than anything I had ever experienced. It was the silence of a vacuum. I didn't even think about it. I just moved. I tore down my tent, stuffing it haphazardly into its sack. I threw my equipment, my notebooks, my food, all of it into my pack. I didn't care about being neat or efficient. I just needed to get out. I ran. I crashed through the undergrowth, ignoring the trail, branches whipping at my face, my lungs burning. I didn't stop until I reached my car, hours later. I never filed my report. I never finished the project. I told my advisor I had contracted a severe illness and couldn't complete the fieldwork. I couldn't tell him the truth. I couldn't explain that the town hadn't died of typhus. It had died of the place itself. It was a sickness of the ground, an echo trapped in the mountains, and I had stood right in the middle of it and listened. There were 3 of us, the way there had always been. Me, Leo, and Ethan. We'd been friends since our freshman year of college, a bond forged over late-night study sessions, cheap beer, and a shared feeling of being a long way from home. After we graduated, we made a pact to get together once a year for a real trip, something to escape our boring entry-level jobs and reconnect. The first year was a road trip to the coast. The next, a hiking trip out west. This year, it was Ethan's pick. He chose a week-long canoe circuit through a remote chain of lakes in the Adirondacks. It was late September, and he sold us on the idea of crisp autumn air, non-existent crowds, and the incredible fall colors. Leo and I were in. Ethan was always the planner, the engine of our trio. He had more energy, more charisma, and a seemingly endless appetite for pushing boundaries. Leo was the anchor, steady and calm, the one who made sure Ethan's wild ideas didn't get us all killed. I was usually the mediator, the one who found the middle ground between them. The first day was perfect. The air was cool and smelled of pine and damp leaves. The water was like glass, reflecting a sky so blue it hurt to look at, and the hillsides were on fire with reds, oranges, and yellows. We paddled for hours, our movements falling into an easy, familiar rhythm. Ethan was in a solo kayak, zipping ahead and then circling back to us in our two-person canoe, cracking jokes and telling stories. It felt just like old times. That night, we made camp on a small island, built a fire, and cooked our dehydrated meals. Ethan was in charge of securing the food barrels, hoisting them up a tree to keep them away from bears. We sat by the fire for hours, talking and laughing, the easy camaraderie making the whole trip feel worthwhile. When I woke up the next morning, the first thing I saw was the mess. One of the food barrels was on the ground, torn open, its contents strewn across the campsite. A bear had gotten to it. We had lost half our food on the very first night. Ethan was mortified. "Oh man, I am so sorry. The rope must have slipped. I can't believe I did that." He seemed so genuinely upset that it was impossible to be mad at him. It was a stupid, costly mistake, but it was just a mistake. We rationed out our remaining food and planned to push harder to make up for lost time. The next incident happened 2 days later. We were navigating a narrow, winding river that connected two of the larger lakes. The current was faster here, and the channel was littered with submerged rocks. Ethan was in the lead, supposedly guiding us through the safest path. He shouted back at us, telling us to stick to the left bank. We followed his instruction, but within minutes, we heard a sickening crunching sound as the bottom of our canoe scraped hard against a series of sharp rocks. We managed to get through without capsizing, but when we pulled over to inspect the damage, we saw a long, deep gash in the hull. It wasn't leaking yet, but it was badly compromised. "Whoa, that looked nasty," Ethan said, paddling over with a concerned look. "The map showed this whole section as deep water. That's weird." Leo was quiet, running his hand over the gash. He looked from the canoe to Ethan, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something other than annoyance in his eyes. It was suspicion, but I pushed the thought away. It was Ethan. He was reckless, sure, but he wasn't malicious. The turning point for me was the map. The next morning, it was gone. We had a single, detailed topographical map of the area, a crucial piece of equipment. Ethan had been using it to navigate the day before. We turned the campsite upside down. We emptied every pack, every dry bag. It was nowhere. "I don't understand," Ethan said, shaking his head with a look of theatrical disbelief. I folded it up and put it in the side pocket of my pack. I know I did. He looked so convincing, but something felt wrong. We were now in the middle of a vast wilderness, miles from any road, with limited food, a damaged canoe, and no map. We were completely reliant on Ethan's memory of the route. Leo pulled me aside while Ethan was down by the water's edge. His voice was low and urgent. "You don't believe him, do you? The food barrel, the rocks, now the map. This isn't bad luck, Maya. He's doing this." I didn't want to believe it. It didn't make any sense. Why would he do that? Why, Leo? What reason would he have? Leo just shook his head. "I don't know. For the thrill? Because he's bored? Look at him. He's not scared. He's loving this. He loves that we're depending on him." I looked over at Ethan. He was skipping stones across the water, a little smile on his face, and a cold dread began to settle in my stomach. That afternoon, we reached the shore of a massive lake. I knew from studying the map earlier that the marked route was a long paddle that hugged the shoreline, a journey that would take the rest of the day but was safe. Ethan stopped and pointed directly across the vast expanse of open water. "That's the shortest way," he announced. "We cut straight across. We'll be at the next portage in 2 hours. Leo immediately shut him down. "No way, Ethan. Look at those clouds. The wind on these big lakes can turn in minutes. It's a stupid risk." Ethan's friendly demeanor vanished. It was like a switch was flipped. His face hardened. "It's not a risk. It's an adventure. Something you two seem to have forgotten how to have. We lost time because of the bear and the slow paddling. This is how we make it up." His voice was sharp, condescending. The argument got heated, but we were trapped. He was the only one who knew the way, and he refused to take the long route. We had no choice but to follow him out onto the open water. The wind picked up within half an hour, just as Leo had predicted. The water, which had been calm, was now a sea of whitecaps. Our damaged canoe felt terrifyingly unstable, pitching and rolling with every wave. We were struggling, paddling with all our strength just to keep the bow pointed into the waves. Ethan in his kayak seemed to be having no trouble at all. He was riding the swells, a wide, unnatural grin on his face. He paddled up alongside us, his kayak bobbing easily in the waves that were threatening to swamp us. "See? Isn't this more exciting than hugging the shore?" He yelled over the wind, his eyes bright with a strange, manic energy. Leo screamed at him to back off, to give us space. Ethan just laughed. Then, as a large wave lifted us up, he drove the front of his kayak hard into our side. It wasn't a huge impact, but it was enough. The canoe, already unstable, tilted sharply. I remember a split second of weightlessness, seeing the gray, angry water rushing up to meet me, and then the bone-deep shock of the cold. I came up sputtering, the icy water stealing my breath. The canoe was overturned beside me. I saw Leo surface a few feet away, his face a mask of shock and fury. We were in the middle of a huge, freezing lake, a long way from any shore. Hypothermia would set in within minutes. I looked for Ethan. He was sitting in his kayak about 20 yards away, just watching us. He wasn't paddling to help. He wasn't calling out. He was just floating there, motionless, his paddle across his lap, with that same terrifyingly empty smile on his face. He watched us struggle to get a grip on the slippery, overturned canoe. He watched as the first waves of numbing cold began to paralyze our limbs. He watched us, and he did nothing. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if to himself. He turned his kayak and began paddling away, not back the way we came, but towards the distant shore he had been leading us to. We screamed for him, but he never looked back. We were left alone in the freezing water. I don't know how long we were in the water. We clung to the canoe, kicking desperately, our bodies going numb. By some miracle, the wind and current pushed us slowly towards an outcrop of rock. We managed to crawl out of the water, our bodies shaking uncontrollably. It took us another day of walking through the woods, freezing and in shock, to find an old logging road and, eventually, help. The authorities searched for Ethan. They found his kayak pulled up on the shore of the lake, but he was gone. He just vanished. I still don't know why he did it. Maybe Leo was right. Maybe he was just bored. Maybe he thought our friendship, our lives, were just a game. The scariest part is that the person I trusted most in the world, the person I would have followed anywhere, was the one who led us out into that water and left us to die. The job wasn't romantic. I wasn't out there to find myself or write a book or any of that nonsense. I was there because my job at the paper mill had been shipped overseas, and the pay for sitting in a glass box for 3 months watching for fires was better than anything else I could find. The supervisor who hired me, a guy named Dave, laid it out pretty plainly. The work is 99% boredom and 1% panic. You watch the trees. You see smoke, you radio it in with the coordinates from the Osborne firefinder. That's it. The tower was on a peak so remote you had to get the last few miles by a rough access road and then hike a final half-mile straight up. It was a steel skeleton with a single 14 by 14 foot room on top, surrounded by windows and a narrow walkway. For the next 3 months, this metal box on stilts and the 100 vertical feet of ladder to get to it would be my whole world. The solitude, Dave had warned me, gets to people. I told him I preferred it. At the time, I believed it. The first few weeks were easy. I fell into a routine. Wake up with the sun, make coffee on my little propane stove, and start scanning the horizon. Miles and miles of rolling green mountains, an ocean of trees under a vast sky. It was pretty, I guess, but mostly it was just empty. I'd do a full 360-degree sweep with the binoculars every 15 minutes. I'd read old paperbacks, do push-ups until my arms burned, and listen to the hiss of the radio. My only real human contact was a woman's voice, a dispatcher named Maria, who I did radio checks with twice a day. Her voice was calm and professional, a thin thread connecting me back to a world that felt a million miles away. The silence up there is something else. It's not just quiet, it's a pressure. It pushes in on you. After a while, you start to hear the blood pumping in your own ears. I first saw it at the beginning of my 3rd week. It was mid-afternoon, hot and still. My eyes were tired from staring at the endless green, and then I saw it. A thin column of smoke rising from a ridge to the northwest, maybe 15 miles out. It was dark smoke, almost black, which usually means a structure fire or something synthetic, not a forest fire. I focused the binoculars on it. It was a tight, clean pillar, not like the messy plume of a real wildfire. I got on the radio, Tower 7 to dispatch. Maria's voice crackled back. "Go ahead, 7. I gave her the coordinates, described the smoke. She told me to stand by. I kept watching it. It didn't spread. It didn't billow or drift on the breeze. It just stood there, a perfect black line drawn against the blue sky. After 10 minutes, Maria came back on the radio. Tower 7, we've got nothing. No registered burns in that sector. Air Patrol did a flyover on their way back to base. They're reporting clear skies. You sure about this, Frank? I was looking right at it. I'm positive. It's faint, but it's there. I watched it for another hour. Then, as the sun started to dip lower, it just vanished. It didn't fade or dissipate. 1 second it was there, the next it was gone. It happened the next day, same time, same place. A single dark pillar of smoke. I radioed it in again. This time, Maria sounded a little weary. "Okay, Frank," logging it. Again, they found nothing. Again, after about an hour, it simply disappeared. This went on for the rest of the week. Every day, like clockwork, it would appear in the late afternoon. I started calling it the ghost fire. I tried to find a rational explanation. Maybe it was an atmospheric effect, some kind of thermal inversion creating a mirage. Maybe it was some local guy with a smoke generator playing a prank on the new lookout. But it was 15 miles away, in rugged, trackless wilderness. A prank of that scale seemed unlikely. My logs, which had been simple and professional, started to get more detailed about this one single thing. The shape of it, the way it moved, because it did move. Through the powerful binoculars, I could see it wasn't just a static column. It writhed. It twisted in on itself, slow and deliberate, like a thing that was alive. The real change happened about a month in. I was feeling the isolation. I hadn't seen another human being face to face since Dave had dropped me off. I wasn't sleeping well. Every little noise, the groan of the tower in the wind, the scuttling of a mouse, sounded loud as a gunshot in the deep quiet. I started spending my whole day just watching that one spot on the horizon, waiting. I'd have the binoculars trained on the empty ridge for hours before it was due to appear. My conversations with Maria became strained. "Anything to report, Frank?" she'd ask. "Just the usual," I'd say. "It's there." There would be a long pause on her end. "Okay, Frank. Stay hydrated." I could hear what she wasn't saying. She thought I was losing it. Maybe I was. One afternoon, I was watching the smoke writhe and twist, and I saw something that made the breath catch in my throat. The pillar seemed to thicken at the top, to form a crude shape, like a head. And then, I swear to God, the head turned. It turned and it looked right at me. I felt it, a jolt, like making eye contact with someone across a crowded room, but this was from 15 miles away. It was impossible. I threw the binoculars down, my heart hammering against my ribs. I was shaking. It knows I'm here, I thought. The thought was so clear, so certain, it terrified me. It knows I'm watching. The end of my tour was a few weeks away when the weather turned. A massive storm front was moving in, promising high winds and severe lightning. Dave's voice came over the radio in the morning, the first time I'd heard him in months. "Frank, you see that forecast? We need you to come down from the tower until it passes. Standard procedure. Get yourself to the supply cabin at the base and wait it out." The storm was supposed to hit in the late afternoon, the same time my smoke always appeared. A cold, paranoid thought wormed its way into my head. They were trying to stop me from seeing it. They didn't want me to know. "I'm fine up here," I said into the radio. "The tower is grounded, right?" There was a long silence. "Frank, that's an order. It's not safe. Come down from the tower." I didn't answer. I shut the radio off. I had to see it. I had to be here when the storm hit. I felt, with a certainty that defied all logic, that something important was about to happen. The sky grew dark, the color of a deep bruise. The wind began to shriek, making the whole tower sway and groan. Rain began to lash against the windows. And then, out on the horizon, through the sheeting rain, it appeared, the column of smoke. It was darker than ever, a slash of absolute black against the violent gray sky. I grabbed the binoculars, my hands slick with sweat. The tower shuddered as the first crack of lightning split the sky, the thunder a physical blow that vibrated up through the steel legs. In the momentary brilliant flash of light, I saw it. It wasn't smoke. It was a thing. It was a colossal shape, standing on that distant ridge, impossibly tall, taller than any tree. It was vaguely human in form, but its limbs were too long, its shape fluid and wrong. It was made of pure darkness, and as another bolt of lightning illuminated the scene, I saw its head turn toward me again. There was no face, no features, just an abyss, but I knew it was looking at me. It had been looking at me all summer. The tower groaned, and the wind screamed, and the lightning flashed, and this impossible silent giant stood on a mountain 15 miles away and watched me. I don't remember screaming, but I must have. I don't remember anything else until the next morning. The storm was over. The sky was clear. A ranger had climbed the tower to check on me. He found me on the floor, huddled under the console, the radio still off. They took me down from that tower and I never went back. I don't know what I saw. Nobody believed me, of course. They called it high-altitude psychosis, severe cabin fever. But I know what I saw in that flash of lightning. I live in a town now. I have a job in a warehouse, no windows. I try not to look at the sky too much, especially when the clouds are dark. Sometimes I think about that thing, standing on its lonely mountain, and I wonder if it's still watching. It was supposed to be a reset. That's what the grief counselor called it. A way to build new memories. It had been almost a year since I lost my wife, and my daughter Lily was still so quiet. She was 8, and the light had just gone out of her eyes. So I packed our old station wagon with a tent, sleeping bags, and a cooler full of hot dogs and marshmallows, and we headed for the mountains. The plan was a week of camping at a state park we used to go to every summer, a place full of echoes of her mother. Maybe it was a bad idea, but I thought if we could just face the memories head on, we could start to move past them. The first day of the drive was good. Lily actually smiled. We played road trip games, and she pointed out cows and funny-shaped clouds. For the first time in months, it felt like we might actually be okay. We were deep in the winding mountain roads, only an hour from our destination. when the sky opened up. It wasn't just rain, it was a deluge, a solid wall of water that turned the road into a river. I had to slow to a crawl. Up ahead, a state trooper was flagging cars down. The road was washed out. A bridge a few miles ahead was gone. There was no way through. He pointed us toward a detour, a narrow county road he said would eventually loop back to the main highway, but it would add a couple of hours to our trip. We had no choice. The detour took us deeper into the woods, onto roads that felt like they hadn't been paved in 50 years. The rain had stopped, but the forest was dripping and shrouded in a thick, wet mist. It was on one of these forgotten roads that I heard the thump, thump, thump of a flat tire. I pulled over, cursing under my breath. When I got out, the air was thick and smelled of wet earth and decay. The tire was completely shredded. I had a spare, but it was one of those small temporary donuts, and I had no idea how far we were from a real town. It was then that a pickup truck, old but immaculately clean, came rattling down the road and pulled over behind us. A man in overalls with a kind, weathered face got out. "Looks like you've got some trouble there," he said, his voice a gentle baritone. Before I could even fully explain, he had a proper jack and a full-size tire out of the back of his truck. He insisted on changing it himself, refusing any offer of payment. "Folks gotta help folks," he said with a placid smile. "You're just outside our town. Follow me in. Our mechanic will fix your tire right. No charge." It was an incredible stroke of luck. I felt a wave of relief. We followed his truck for another mile and pulled into a town that looked like it was straight off a postcard. The place was pristine. Every house was perfectly painted. Every lawn was emerald green and neatly trimmed, and every picket fence was a dazzling white. There were flowers in window boxes, and quaint, old-fashioned signs on the few businesses that lined the main street. A sign at the town entrance read, "Welcome. We're glad you're here." The man led us to a small garage where the mechanic, another friendly, smiling man, promised to have our tire patched in an hour. He also refused any payment. "Just happy to help," he said. Everyone we saw smiled and waved. An older woman who ran the local inn insisted we take a room for the night, on the house. "The roads are still slick," she said, her eyes crinkling kindly. "You and your little one should rest." The friendliness was overwhelming. It was strange, but in a world that often felt cold and indifferent, it was a welcome change. I figured we had just stumbled into one of those rare, truly good places. It was Lily who first noticed the pins. Everyone, and I mean everyone, was wearing a small pin on their shirt or jacket. It was carved from dark wood into the shape of a pine cone. As we settled into our room at the inn, I started to notice other odd things. The town was getting ready for some kind of festival. People were hanging decorations, but they weren't cheerful ribbons or balloons. They were bundles of dark, twisted twigs tied with black string. There were intricate lattices made from what looked like animal bones hanging in the windows of the shops, and the townspeople's attention on Lily was unnerving. They'd stop and stare at her, their smiles never faltering. They commented on her blonde hair, calling it sun-kissed for the new season. They offered her homemade candies that looked like polished river stones. The innkeeper knelt down and looked into Lily's eyes. "Such bright eyes," she said softly. "Such fertile ground for new growth." I pulled Lily a little closer to me. The words were meant to be a compliment, I'm sure, but they made my skin crawl. That evening, I decided to take a walk while Lily was watching an old television in our room. The sun was setting, and the town was bathed in a soft, orange glow, but the atmosphere was anything but peaceful. I saw the townspeople begin to gather in the square in the center of town. There was no music, no chatter. They just walked from their perfect houses and formed a large, silent circle. In the center of the circle, a huge pile of wood had been built into a pyre. They weren't looking at the pyre. They were all standing still, facing outward from the circle, facing my direction, facing the inn. The mechanic was there. The innkeeper was there. The man who had helped us on the road. Dozens of them, all wearing their pine cone pins, all standing in silent, unnerving vigil. The feeling of being watched was immense, a physical pressure. I hurried back to the inn, my heart pounding. This wasn't friendliness. This was something else entirely. I checked my phone. No signal. The inn didn't have Wi-Fi, and the rotary phone in the room just gave a dead tone. We were cut off. I decided we were leaving. First thing in the morning, patched tire or not, we were getting out. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of the old inn sounded like a footstep outside our door. Around 2 in the morning, I decided I couldn't wait. We would leave now, under the cover of darkness. I went out to the car, parked behind the inn, to make sure it was ready. The tire was fixed, just as the mechanic had promised, but the car wouldn't start. It wouldn't even turn over. I popped the hood. I'm no mechanic, but I know what a distributor cap is, and I know where it's supposed to be. The spot where it should have been was empty. He hadn't just fixed our tire. He had trapped us here. Panic, cold and sharp, seized me. I ran back to the room and gently woke Lily. "We're going to play a game, sweetie," I whispered, my voice trembling. "It's a sneaking game. We have to be very, very quiet and get out of the town without anyone seeing us." Her eyes were wide with fear, but she nodded. We slipped out the back door of the inn into the night. The town square was empty now, the pyre a dark shape against the starry sky. But the town wasn't asleep. As my eyes adjusted to the dark, I saw them. A figure on a porch swing, moving slowly back and forth without a sound. A silhouette in a dark window. A man standing perfectly still at the edge of his perfect lawn. They were sentinels. They were waiting. They weren't trying to stop us, not yet. They were just watching. I grabbed Lily's hand and we ducked into the shadows, moving through the backyards, my heart in my throat. We had to stay off the streets. The whole town felt like a giant, silent trap. We heard a soft, melodic whistle from a few houses down, and it was answered by another from the other side of the street. They were communicating. They knew we were out. The sneaking game had just become a hunt. We scrambled over a low stone wall and plunged into the woods at the edge of the town. The forest was pitch black and tangled with undergrowth that tore at our clothes. Behind us, I could hear them starting to search. There were no shouts, no angry calls, just more of that strange, bird-like whistling, getting closer. We ran, stumbling through the dark, with no sense of direction other than away. Away from that pristine, perfect, silent town. We ran until our lungs burned and Lily was sobbing from exhaustion. We followed the sound of a creek, hoping it would lead us somewhere, anywhere. At dawn, scraped, muddy, and terrified, we stumbled out of the woods and onto a paved highway. The first truck that came by screeched to a halt. The driver's face was a mixture of shock and pity. I never told him the full story. I didn't tell the police either. I just said our car broke down and we got lost in the woods. They wouldn't have believed the truth. I still don't know what they wanted, or what their spring awakening was for, but I know they were getting ready for it. And I know they looked at my daughter like she was the guest of honor.